Now, in the Horn of Africa, drought, poor governance and ongoing conflict have combined to create this catastrophic famine. Experts say that at other times in the past, such factors have produced similar periods of famine or food insecurity. VOA's Todd Grosshans has a look now at this unfortunate history.
Yes, it's about bad weather, the lack of rain, but analysts say conflict continues to be the biggest barrier to getting food and water to victims of famine in the Horn of Africa. The lack of peace is just as consequential as drought, says Richard Downey with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C.
This is a region that's suffered conflict for, centuries. I mean, really, if we take a look back in the past 50 years, each of these countries in this region have suffered conflict in one shape or form, often very, very violent civil war as well. When war breaks out, people can't go about their daily lives, and because so many people in this region rely on farming, subsistence farming, to survive. Well, if you have a war going on in your region, you can't go out and tend your crops, and you can't go out and harvest them. So this has a terrible impact on people's livelihoods.
Somalia, Kenya, Eritrea, Ethiopia, with varying degrees of competence, all have had governments that have been distracted by conflict.
There's a history, a pattern of poor governance in these countries, which undoubtedly has made the situation worse in terms of people's food security.
In Ethiopia, poor governance in the 1970s and 80s, as millions were starving, led to the ouster of President Mengistu Haile Mariam and the once revered emperor Haile Selassie.
And it's very interesting because his successor, Mengistu, ruled a sort of reign of terror, but didn't learn the lessons from his predecessor. And in fact, it was when another famine arrived in Ethiopia that his days were numbered as well.
Famine in the Horn of Africa has historically often created conditions where unscrupulous governments manipulate international aid for their own political benefit. Okay. According to Melvin Ayogu with the Brookings Institute.
It's quite possible to manage the distribution in a way that favors those who belong to a political camp. So it can actually be used as a political instrument, it's an instrument of political control.
Famine is used as a weapon of war, and you've seen this in Ethiopia, where ruling governments and their opponents use famine conditions to alienate and suppress opponents or perceived enemies.
CSIS's Richard Downey says the al-Qaeda-linked al-Shabaab militia in Somalia is another prominent example of the use of commandeered international food aid as a weapon of war.
They've seen food aid as a way, as a revenue source for themselves. They've used it to buttress themselves and increase their hold on power.
Weak, sometimes corrupt governments dealing with violent insurgencies have historically reacted with extra doses of repression in the face of famine. Government repression and lack of transparency makes it almost impossible for outside agencies and the international community to gauge the severity of the problem in, for instance, Eritrea.
Mainly because it has a very closed, repressive government that really is not open to the outside world and is not telling people what's going on internally there.
Kenya has had its share of severe droughts, especially in the northern part of the country. But Kenyan governments have been very stable in comparison to other governments in the region. In Kenya, just across the Somali border, hundreds of thousands of people have sought escape from the fever of violent conflict and famine.
You have the world's largest refugee camp on the Kenyan side of the border. Now 380,000 people living in what's become a permanent settlement. So the Kenyan government has to deal not only with its own food crises and droughts, but also the effects of Somalia's as well.
And yes, weather has affected famine conditions in the Horn of Africa. This means, Downey says, this region of the world has yet another thing to worry about: climate change.
The populations in these countries are living on the edge. When even very small changes in climatic conditions and rainfall can have a really devastating effect. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the cycle of drought increasing more rapidly.
Progressive agricultural methods may eventually mitigate the effects of weather in the Horn of Africa. But for now, an endless cycle of violence is contributing to the famine that faces millions of people in this region. People who will walk hundreds of kilometers to avoid death by starvation or by a bullet.
Ethiopia has had civil war, has fought with Eritrea, has fought with Somalia. If you think about Somalia continuing right now, and the kind of border issues that Kenya has to deal with.
It's just a tough corner of the world to live on. People are stressed, and on a good year, even in a good year, it's kind of a difficult place to survive in.
Our report was produced by VOA's Todd Grosshans. For more information on any of today's stories, please visit us online at voaafrica.com. You can also visit us on Facebook. Just search for In Focus.